Imagining what's next has always been a favorite pastime for writers. We're endlessly promised jetpacks, robot assistants, and other futuristic wonders. But the real question is, what did sci-fi authors from, say, a century ago actually expect from the future of humanity? And more importantly, how many of those wild ideas ended up happening? Let's see how 1960s Americans pictured modern tablets, how Hitler's go-to novelist basically described smartphones, how Russia in the 1800s made fun of what we now call neural networks, and how the Soviets unintentionally dreamed up delivery apps. Back in 1964, legendary sci-fi author and futurist Sir Arthur C. Clarke appeared on British TV. He offered one firm prediction: the future will be fantastic, and that's the only thing we can say for sure. He also noted that the predictions most likely to come true would be the ones that seemed totally ridiculous at the time. His boldest prediction, that communication technology would advance so far it would make geography meaningless. Running a company from Bali or Tahiti, he claimed, would be just as easy as managing it from central London. People would connect instantly without having the slightest clue where the other person was physically located. In 1964, this sounded like pure fantasy. Now, of course, it's just another Tuesday. Arthur C. Clarke also helped write the screenplay for Stanley Kubrick's iconic film 2001: A Space Odyssey, which ended up showcasing several of his futuristic ideas. The most obvious one that actually came true? Tablets. In the movie, Kubrick's astronauts used sleek screens to view updates and video messages. Clarke also worked in the idea of video calling, a concept that felt wildly futuristic at the time. Now, most of us can't even be bothered to turn our cameras on during Zoom meetings. Clarke also foresaw voice-activated tech. In 2001, A Space Odyssey, the ship's AI could recognize crew members by voice, much like how today's smart assistants work. The movie even introduced another familiar sight: screens built into the backs of passenger seats, though here they were on space shuttles, not airplanes. Oddly enough, real brands made it into the film too. Clarke and Kubrick were right in guessing that companies like the BBC, Hilton, and IBM would still be around in the 2000s. While Clarke was busy offering Brits a vision of space vacations and work-from-home lifestyles, Soviet sci-fi writers were painting a world of endless resources. The USSR had its own science fiction legends, the Strugatsky brothers. Boris Strugatsky once said sci-fi writers make terrible fortune tellers, but still, they nailed a few things, like Google. Their characters often searched for facts through something called the Great Planetary Informatorium. No ads, no clickbait, just cold bureaucratic info. It was also incredibly slow. A basic question could take hours to answer. In their novel, The Final Circle of Paradise, the Strugatsky brothers predicted the rave scene nearly 2 decades before the first rave ever happened, and a good 10 years ahead of the first discotheques. Their depiction of Western youth, naturally portrayed in a critical light, showed crowds dancing under pulsating, multicolored strobe lights in a trance-like state. Back in the early 1960s, they also imagined home delivery, but not by couriers. Instead, items were teleported directly into people's apartments. They weren't done there. The brothers also hinted at self-driving vehicles and something eerily close to Bluetooth headsets. Moving walkways stretching from city to city? Still science fiction. One big prediction both Clarke and the Strugatskys got wrong was space travel. The golden age of sci-fi lined up perfectly with the height of the space race. Humans had just broken through Earth's atmosphere and walked on the moon. Naturally, everyone assumed that trips to Venus were just a decade away. Instead, the momentum fizzled out. Today, Clarke's Pan Am spaceliners and the Strugatskys' Martian archaeologists feel almost like punchlines. And then there were the aliens. In Roadside Picnic, the Strugatskys imagined an alien visitation that left behind a mysterious and dangerous wasteland. Tarkovsky adapted the novel into his 1979 film Stalker, set in one of these forbidden zones. The twist? A few years later, reality caught up. In 1986, Chernobyl turned into a real-life zone. No aliens required. When the game Stalker came out in the 2000s, the developers dropped the extraterrestrials entirely and just set the whole thing in Chernobyl. Trips to Mars haven't exactly panned out either, despite the fact that we've been dreaming about the Red Planet ever since we found out it was even there. Back in 1908, Alexander Bogdanov, a Bolshevik revolutionary and one of Lenin's closest pre-revolution allies, published a novel called Red Star. The premise? A radical discovers that Martians have been secretly living among humans. They invite him to visit their planet where communism has already triumphed. His departure point, a psychiatric hospital. The moon, at least, was more successful, though we didn't get there quite the way 19th century author Jules Verne envisioned. In From the Earth to the Moon, his astronauts were launched via a colossal cannon inside an aluminum capsule with plush interior padding. And yet, Verne wasn't entirely wrong. He correctly guessed the number of crew members, 3, just like Apollo, and the launch location, Florida. Even the cannon wasn't totally off. By the 1960s, the Pentagon had a functioning prototype of an enormous gun that could theoretically launch objects into low orbit. Verne had a real talent for seeing what was coming. One of his earliest and lesser-known works, Paris in the 20th Century, was written when he was still a young man. In it, he described video calls, something eerily close to television, towering skyscrapers, and a vast network of high-speed trains. People were executed with electricity, banks operated using mechanical calculators, and there was even a rough version of the internet built on telegraph lines. But culture had all but vanished. Art was irrelevant, and society cared only about profit and new tech. Sound familiar? Basically, Instagram in a nutshell. Verne's publisher refused to print it, calling the predictions too grim. There's no way the world would ever end up like that, they argued. No need to alarm the public. The book finally saw the light of day in 1994, by which point, well, there wasn't much left to be shocked about. The 19th century, in general, produced some strangely on-point predictions. Take Fadej Bulgarin, a contemporary of Pushkin who foresaw neural networks. In the 1820s, he published a book with a typically long title for the time, Plausible Falsehoods or A Journey Around the World in the 29th Century. It described panel-style apartment blocks, underwater vessels, flying machines, roller skates, and even something eerily close to modern photocopiers. And yet Bulgarin said it all in the 29th century, because back in Pushkin's day, it seemed inconceivable that humanity would invent these things in just a couple hundred years. The most surprising detail, his uncanny prediction of neural networks. In the book, the main character encounters 2 machines. One writes poetry, the other prose. The poetry machine produces impeccable verse, strictly following every rule of rhyme and rhythm, but it's utterly meaningless. The prose machine, meanwhile, spits out text that's grammatically fine, but painfully bland, filled with borrowed phrases and recycled cliches. In other words, the man practically sketched out ChatGPT nearly 200 years before it existed. Smartphones didn't really catch anyone off guard, at least not in fiction. Long before they became reality, they were envisioned by none other than Hitler's favorite author, Ernst Junger. Not that Junger shared Hitler's politics. He had stepped away from political life before the First World War, and eventually dove into science fiction. In his 1949 novel Heliopolis, Junger introduced pocket-sized phone computers connected to a global information network. He also nailed a key detail. Smartphones would become powerful status symbols. In his imagined world, a device's color, worn openly in a breast pocket, instantly reveals a person's place in the social hierarchy. A gold one means direct access to national elites. Criminals, their devices are confiscated along with their rights. An oddly specific and impressively accurate prediction. But outside of that, Junger's futurism didn't hit many targets. Like many visionaries, his track record was more miss than hit. Take H.G. Wells. In 1901, he released Anticipations, a book packed with forecasts for the future, some strikingly bold, others hilariously off the mark. He did, for instance, predict the invention of airplanes, but he insisted that powered flight wouldn't happen until at least 1950. Just 2 years later, the Wright brothers lifted off, likely before Wells's first edition even sold out. He did get a few things right, like people ordering goods over the telephone, but much of Anticipations reads like speculative comedy today. His imagined world featured swarms of military airships, soldiers pedaling into battle on bicycles, and naval warfare dominated by land-based battleships. In his future, radios were strictly for military use, and submarines were considered pointless death traps, because, according to Wells, their crews would either suffocate or go mad. Undeterred, he gave future gazing another go in 1933 with The Shape of Things to Come. This time, Wells came a bit closer to reality. He famously predicted that a global war would begin with Germany invading Poland, but after that, things took another wild turn. According to his vision, civilization was nearly wiped out by mass-scale biological warfare, and what remained of society was ruled by pilots, flying over a scorched, lawless wasteland. In 1946, in his final essay Mind at the End of Its Tether, Wells went all in, warning that humanity was on the brink of extinction. Needless to say, the apocalypse apocalypse he feared never arrived. Looking back, it's not the dystopian visions that came true. There was no robot uprising, no nuclear apocalypse, no alien conquest. What actually arrived were the quieter things: video calls, digital assistants, doorstep groceries. And if there's a message in all that, it's this: maybe the future won't be terrifying, maybe it'll just be a little more convenient, and maybe that's not so bad. Love you guys, thank you for watching, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.